Hi there, I'm Sue Stockdale, and welcome to episode 130 of the Access to Inspiration podcast, the show where you can be inspired by people who may be unlike you. Whether it's an ocean rower or a mountain climber, we hope their stories and insights will inspire you to reflect on the world differently. In this episode, I'm speaking to Urs Koenig, a former United Nations peacekeeper, who talks to me about humble leadership. Urs shares his insights and experiences from his time serving as a peacekeeper, and explains the importance of asking better and bigger questions, building meaningful relationships with team members, and applying a growth mindset to navigate complex and challenging situations effectively. Remember, you can read a transcription of this episode as you listen on our website, accesstoinspiration.org. So listen in as we discover more about humble leadership. Welcome to the podcast, Urs Koenig. It's lovely to speak to you today.
Thanks for having me, Sue. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Now, I always love when we get guests that are recommended by other guests we've had before. And you're recommended by Janine Canham, who was in episode 62 of the podcast. And I know that you and her share an interest in ultra-endurance events. She'd spoken about that in her episode. What, from your perspective, do you enjoy about running long distances, yours?
Well, it's a great opening question, Sue. I love it. I enjoy many aspects of it. One aspect is the adventure and being out there and the focus on one task at hand. Like everything else falls away when you're doing a long bike race or a long run. I don't think about my work. I don't think about my kids, frankly. I don't think about all my to-dos. So it's just focusing on the task at hand and immersing myself in the experience. I think that's one of the things I really enjoy. And even though ultra events are solo events for the most part, you always have a crew, a team that supports you. And so I thrive on achieving hard stuff together with other people. So I enjoy the team aspect, the camaraderie of it as well a great deal.
So I suspect, as I hear your response there, that we're already treading into the other areas that we're going to be talking about today around leadership, about humility, and about getting the best out of a team. So on your book that you so kindly provided me to have a look at ahead of time, the Radical Humility book, which I was really fascinated by, on the front cover it says, former United Nations peacekeeper. Now, tell me about that, because it's not that many people I know that have that underneath their name.
Yes, you're absolutely correct. So I'm Swiss, and as such, I served in the national service when I was in my 20s. So that's the mandatory service. But then I went back in after having been out for 22 years. I went back into the service to serve as a peacekeeper first for NATO in the Balkans and then for the UN in the Middle East. 2 years ago, that was actually. So I was always drawn to meaningful international work. I actually am a geographer by trade. I originally studied geography because I wanted to get into this line of work. And then for a variety of reasons, I didn't. And in parallel to that, my dad, who retired from his corporate career, immersed himself in international mission work, not religious mission work, but overseas, what we back then called overseas aid and election observation. So he was a great inspiration for me. So when I was approaching 50, I had one of those, we could call it maybe midlife episodes. And I literally asked myself, what are the things I still want to experience? What are the things I still want to do? And not look back with regret and wish I would have done that. And meaningful international work was one of those things. And so I looked around various NGOs, government organizations, and I found as part of my research, peacekeeping. And I went, I've been an officer many years ago. There's some responsibility. It's decently well paid. So I applied. But it was a humbling experience on a personal level, I can tell you that, having been out for that long to go back in. But I got a lot out of the experience. As you know, I write about it extensively in my book. And I love the aspect that it's not unproblematic. It's, of course, political like everything else, but it's still noble work. It really makes a difference on the ground. And then unsurprisingly, because I'm such a passionate guy about leadership, the whole aspect of working with an international team, with officers from all over the world in a conflict zone, I just totally get a kick out of that. I just really, really enjoyed that.
Well, it's a fascinating setting, I imagine, to be experiencing leadership, doing leadership and observing how other people lead. You mentioned the word humility there, Urs, and of course that's at the heart of what you've been writing about here. How did humility show up for you during that peacekeeping experience?
So I think on a personal level, it showed up in the way that I never really understood the conflict as much as I studied. I could study, you can study the Middle East for years and decades, and anybody who's been there will tell you that. You think you get it, and then something happens out of the nowhere, and you go like, oh my God, I still don't get it. So that's a humbling experience on a personal level. And so it sort of drove me to always ask better and bigger questions. And so the answers were okay, but the questions, the quality of the questions certainly improved. So that was humbling on a personal level. And then to my surprise, going back into what we think of traditional top-down command control environment actually showed me that the best commanders I had were deeply humble. They had great self-awareness. They built meaningful relationships with their team members, and they applied a growth mindset. And so I write about this in my book. And I myself, of course, because I was in a leadership position, try to also live the humble leadership. So the two peacekeeping missions really were the catalyst for me to dig deep into the role that humility can lead in leadership. And of course, the results of that quest was then the book that I just published.
So having had that experience of being a peacekeeper then, Urs, and you said you felt compelled to write about it, I'm just wondering why humility spoke to you as a characteristic or a quality more than anything else about leadership.
I was always drawn to humble people. And as you know, in ultra-endurance events, there's a lot of machos and type A personalities, but I was always drawn to competitors who let, as I would say, their legs do the talking versus their big mouth. And so that was true in my personal and my business life as well. I was always on a personal level drawn to highly successful people who could have the humility and say, I actually don't know, but I'll go and find out. And people drive me crazy who have an answer about everything. So that's on a personal level. I was always drawn to that. But then I was an executive coach for many years. And as we came out of the financial crisis, social media started to explode. Everything seemed to move faster and faster and faster. And we entered the famous VUCA world, which so many people write about. And I experienced my executive coaching clients always being a step behind. And then many of them were still leading very traditional top-down command control. And that got me digging into humility as not just a desirable personal trait, but as something that could actually make a difference in terms of our leadership. And then I stumbled across Edgar and Peter Schein's work on humble leadership. And that really piqued my interest. And actually also rewinding for a little bit, Jim Collins was the first person writing about humility, the importance of humility in leadership. This is now, whatever it is, 23 years ago, right? And that was actually a foundational book for me as well. And so I had this personal affinity towards humility, and then I experienced it myself as a powerful trait in leadership. And then this work was published by Peter and Edgar Schein. I went, okay, let's really dig in there. And so I guess that's where my interest then really peaked.
So the one thing that I find curious is if we looked in the media these days, generally the sense of leadership we get is almost more heroic leadership. It's the often, dare I say, people with large egos that we are shown to be as maybe not necessarily effective leaders, but leadership nonetheless. So I'm wondering why you think that humility, the leadership that you write about, is of the now as opposed to the approaches that we see in the media.
So I think there is a loudmouth bias in the media. I'm not a media expert, but if I'm publisher of a magazine, of a paper, an online publication, I look for stuff that makes splashes, right? So I think you're absolutely right. There's an overrepresentation of not humble leaders in the media. And then we might conclude that, oh, well, that's actually the way to lead it. But I would put forward that the faster things move, the more complex our role becomes, the more we need to actually apply a humble mindset. And maybe I can just briefly describe what I actually mean by leading with radical humility. It's first and foremost having deep self-awareness, seeing myself in line with how others see me, having good awareness around my strengths and weaknesses. And so if we think about it, the faster things move, the more complex our role becomes, the more important it is for me to know what I'm capable of and where I need help. So that's the first leg of the stool. It also is this notion of focus, having the humility that I know I can't do everything, but I can do almost anything I put my mind to. And so many of us struggle with this because there's so many things we could do, and being very thoughtful about what I should be doing. And as Michael Porter famously said, the most important decision in strategy is deciding what not to do. and having the humility to say no to everything else. So that's the first leg of the stool. The second leg is leading relationally. And if we think about it, in today's world, we're facing an inversion of expertise as leaders. Our people will always know so much more than we ever can about their area of expertise. For them to come to us with the data and information we so clearly rely on as their leaders, they need to trust us. And the only way they'll trust us and share all the information, the good, the bad, and the ugly, is if we've built meaningful and collaborative relationships with them. So I would put forward to really have empowered execution at the front lines versus everything goes through the heroic leader and he or she makes all the decisions by himself. We need to actually really apply ourselves to humble leadership to be successful in today's VUCA world.
And when we think about that approach to leadership, the leaders that show humility, who comes to mind for you? So if we're back to this media portraying role models, who are the role models that we either ought to see in the media or that do exist but maybe don't get the same attention as others?
I think one person that actually got a lot of attention is Jacinda Ardern, former Prime Minister of New Zealand. And I know I have plenty of Kiwi friends, not everybody agreed with everything she did through the COVID crisis, but she was a tough leader during the Christchurch terrorist attack, the onset of the COVID crisis. But on many occasions, she shared with vulnerability about her life outside of governing the country. Her sharing what it was like imagine that she gave birth while holding the highest office in the country. That made her relatable. And so I think Jacinda Ardern is somebody who I admire. I write about a bunch of people in the book. The former CEO of the financial technology company Intuit, Brad Smith, is another example. He did a 360. I volunteered to do a 360, and as most of your listeners probably know, a 360 anonymously surveys everybody around your strengths and weaknesses as a leader, and it can be a slightly terrifying experience. And as you and I know, every good executive coaching engagement starts off with that. But he then shared his 360 with the entire company. He emailed his 360 report, his strengths and his weaknesses and his action plans to the entire company, and made it safe then for everybody at Intuit to own their own weaknesses and start working on them. So Brad Smith is another example. And then, of course, probably most well known is Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft. I mean, he really applies himself to humble leadership. I remember the Steve Ballmer sort of big, loud, maybe bullying, one could say, way of leadership. And Satya Nadella really changed the culture at Microsoft based on his own values, curiosity, constant learning, and the growth mindset curriculum is an integral part at Microsoft. So these are three leaders that come to mind that I admire.
I'm glad that you've given us some great examples there. So just coming to the title of your book, Urs, Radical Humility. That is quite radical in of itself, the word radical in a title. Why that word attached to humility?
So it makes for a great book title, does it not?
So are you trying to attract media attention here?
That's my flip answer. But on a serious note, a radical because you can't half-ass humility. You can't just do it because it looks good or when it feels like it. We have to go all in and apply ourselves to leading with humble leadership. And it's not easy. The soft stuff is hard. The soft stuff of becoming more self-aware, the soft stuff of building meaningful collaborative relationships with our team members, the soft stuff is not soft. It's tough. So that's why I put radical in there. And yes, I do also believe it's a nice book title.
As you know, this podcast is a free to listen to podcast, but it's not free to make. So if you're enjoying this episode, then show your appreciation and buy me a coffee. That means just clicking on the Buy Me a Coffee link on the show notes to make a small donation. I can enjoy that coffee when I'm producing the next episode. Your support really encourages us to continue producing quality audio content for our listeners. And if you've not yet read our impact report, which we published recently, I recommend that as well. There's a link on our website and it will tell you how this podcast is positively impacting listeners, guests, and the wider community. Now back to our guest. As I'm listening to you talkers and just reflecting on what you've said so far and what I've read in your book, one might say, well, this is all very well. You're describing we need to be demonstrating vulnerability, we need to be humble, and we need to focus on that to be a better leader. We have to focus on building relationships. And then we have our shareholders, if we're a leader of a company, telling us about delivering on results and financial profitability. And then we have other demands on our time and many other pressures and distractions. Surely it's not quite as easy as just focusing on humble leadership.
Well, the way you put it, I totally agree. I love the challenge there. So that's excellent. And this is why I say be a badass leader and a good human, right? So I put forward that the notion that you either have to be a nice person or a tough leader is a false dichotomy. I get it. We all have pressures, various pressures. I'm a small business owner. You're a small business owner. We have pressures. If you're in a large corporation, you have shareholders breathing down your neck. You need to make the numbers. And so I would put forward that you can do all that. You can deliver on extraordinary expectations and deliver high results while at the same time treating people with respect and building strong relationships, and then actually get the best out of them. So I don't think it's an either or. And I talk about tough on results, tender on people. That is not a contradiction in my mind. I have a story in the book where my commanding officer opened a meeting we had in his office with these words. He said, "Urs, I love you. You know I do. And this is not even close to being good enough, this being my work." And so his words made me shrink in my chair. And why? If he would have yelled at me, if he would have belittled me, I would have tuned him out, because he showed me, and of course we built a relationship over the last 9 months, a strong relationship, because he cared for me. I knew he did. He was really supportive of my own career path. I could then really hear his feedback. And by God, did I turn myself inside out over the next 6 months to deliver only the very best work to his desk. So we can say, "I love you," and this is not good enough. And just to be clear, Sue, sometimes the most loving thing is to let somebody go. So humble leadership is not weak. It's not always being nice. Absolutely not. We can deliver. We can be hard-nosed business drivers while at the same time building collaborative relationships with our people and see them as whole human beings.
I love what you're saying there. It's a both and, not an either or.
That's why it's a Venn diagram on the book, right?
Yeah. Easy for us to understand visually when we see that. Surely that takes courage, in my experience, for any of us as human beings to change. If we've been familiar with a way of leading, a way of behaving, it can be uncomfortable to move into that unknown. What would you recommend to any leader listening to this podcast and thinking, well, I get what he's saying, but how do I start this?
There's one quick thing we can all do, and we never do it enough, which is ask for regular feedback on how we're doing. If you're a listener and you're a manager and you hopefully hold regular one-on-ones with your team members, at the end of every one-on-one, ask, "Hey, Sue, what do I do well as your leader or your manager, and what can I improve?" And ask it every single week. So that's a simple thing. It's not easy. I get it. But as we start, and then in terms of very tactical, announce that you're going to ask that, maybe in a department meeting so people aren't blindsided, and announce that you're going to ask for feedback on a regular basis, and then do it every week so it doesn't become this scary one-off thing you do every 6 or 12 months. And so all of this stuff is very simple. It's not easy. And so why am I not asking for feedback? Because I'm afraid of what I might hear. Or I might not be sure that my people feel actually safe to be honest. And so if that's the case, a tip I have there is actually say, as you know, Sue, I'm working on becoming a better listener. You have some self-awareness about some of the things you want to get better at. How am I doing? What can I do better? What do I do well? So in that way, you give your team member allowance to give you feedback on a goal you set for yourself. So that can sort of be a nice way to open a conversation so your people feel more comfortable being honest with you.
I think what I'm hearing you say there is leaders don't always have to have all the answers, but they need to be able to ask the right questions.
Yes, and by the way, we don't have all the answers. Anybody who claims that they do is full of you know what, right? So let's really think about it. What's my role as a leader? My role as a leader is not to be the smartest person in the room. My role is not to have all the answers, but my role is to facilitate the team so that the team delivers the best results. So to have the right people on the team, I want smarter people on my team than me. I want to be surrounded by people who are all smarter than me. But I'm the leader who facilitates the process that brings the best out of every one of my team members. So that's how I think about it.
Have you ever found it difficult to demonstrate that vulnerability, that humility that you talk about here in challenging situations?
Of course. I mean, I have plenty of flaws as a person, as a leader, there's no question about it. But one thing I really pride myself on, I love seeing my team members shine. And I talk about building a leadership factory, making it the explicit goal for each of my team members to go to the next level, whatever that might look like. And I take great pride in doing that. And I would actually challenge all of us that we should aspire to building a leadership factory in our teams. But of course, I've had plenty of situations where I felt insecure already about maybe I made a mistake, and then I felt hesitant about actually asking for the feedback because I was afraid to hear the response. But coming back again to your bigger point, let's really think about what is my role as a leader. My role as a leader is for my team to produce the very best results. And there has actually just been a study published in an HR journal coming out of Australia, I think it was, that showed that humble leaders actually get promoted faster themselves because of exactly that. They become talent magnets. Word gets around. When your team members go left and right, they leave you, and that sucks because you have to hire a replacement and all that. Let's be real. But at the same time, if you become a talent incubator, that word gets around, and then that makes yourself more attractive for a more senior role.
I love that, what you're saying. And I'm still thinking about this idea of a leadership factory that you described a moment ago. So given our podcast, Urs, is about inspiration, one of the things I always like to ask our guests is who or where do they get their inspiration from?
My dad, my father. I write about him in the book a fair bit. So my dad truly was an extraordinary humble leader. In many ways, he provided psychological safety. Decades before the term even was coined, he was an incredibly tough dad. To me, I describe a situation in the book where he held me accountable for a mistake I made, but he also was tender on me by showing me that he loved me. So my dad was a huge inspiration and continues to be to this day as a leader I aspire to.
If then somebody's been listening to this episode so far and thinking, right, I get what Urs is saying, it's both and, I can be tough and I can be caring and show humility. Given that the first thing you said a moment ago was about asking for feedback, what do I do next after that?
As I mentioned, the other core piece of leading with humility is building meaningful and collaborative relationships with our team members. So one thing I challenge folks to do is draw your own relationship map. So this is, I think I mentioned Ed Shine earlier. This is based on Ed Shine's work. Grab a piece of paper, circle in the middle, that's you. Then around you, draw circles of all the people you're connected to. This is your family and friends, and then your direct reports, your boss, peers, other departments, and then assess the level of relationship you have with each of these folks on a level of 1 to 5. How trusting and meaningful is it? And then assess how trusting and meaningful should it be? And then identify the big gaps. And then literally set aside 15 to 30 minutes and set a goal of putting a relationship building meeting on the calendar. And again, this is simple, but it's not easy. Relationship building starts with a conversation. Share maybe a little bit more than you would normally do, of course, in a cultural context that it's okay and appropriate, and then see how the other person responds. So that's how we deepen relationship. And, relationship building, and I'm now going off again into the bigger topic versus specifically what we can do, but relationship building is such a powerful thing in crisis. I write about a couple of crises we experienced in the Balkans when the stuff hits the fan. And when time of yes, like detailed reporting guidelines and orders, they're all great. But what really matters is being able to pick up the phone, call the right person who you've built the relationship earlier, and be able to cut through the red tape. In the Swiss Armed Forces, we have a saying called "In Krisen Köpfe kennen." It literally means in crisis, know the heads. Know who you can call to cut through the red tape to get stuff done.
You're taking me off on a whole interesting train of thought here, Urs, because I can wholeheartedly agree with you. And I think I would say my own career has been developed on that basis. And yet I recognise today many people are operating virtually, and it brings a different dynamic to the process of relationship building. What have you noticed around the virtual way of relationship building? And have you got any tips for people on how to do that?
I think we just need to be even more intentional. We don't run into each other so at the water cooler like we used to, right? So we have to be really intentional and set some time aside. And as a manager, my most important currency is my time and my attention to my people. There's no more important currency. So I need to be really intentional about setting those times aside for relationship building. I'm not an expert on the virtual or the hybrid world, but what I do know is that we need to be super intentional about when we bring our people together. Why do I bring my team together? And what are we trying to accomplish? That's the time where we can deepen relationship face to face. That's not when we have to have the regular department meetings we have every week over Zoom. And so being intentional, both when we get together and reaching out, even in a virtual world. We can build a relationship, Sue, you and I, over Zoom right now. So it's absolutely doable.
The whole idea of being intentional about it, it means putting a date in a calendar. What do you describe it as? And I know that a lot of the leaders that I work with, sometimes that's what they find challenging. Well, we're not talking about anything, Sue. If I'm meeting this person, what do I call the meeting? And the way to get their head around the idea that meeting to build relationships or to get to know somebody is a value in of itself. It doesn't have to have we're discussing this report or looking at that data.
Yeah. And why? Because we get to know each other better, Sue. Trust deepens. You're more likely to tell me what's really going on. And by the way, humble leadership doesn't mean I need to know all your darkest secrets or I need to reveal all my... No, it doesn't. And also, it doesn't mean that I have to have the same level of relationships with each of my team members. I can have various depth of relationships with each of my team members and not be a phony. Some people want to open up immediately and talk about everything. And other folks, we might just do some small talk about the weekend. And that's totally fine. The important thing for me as a manager and for the listeners is let's see our team members as whole human beings and not just as cogs in the wheel who get stuff done for us.
Thank you for reminding us about that important point. So if you were to go back and reflect on the direction your career has taken, Urs, from when you were a young boy, and you were thinking about what you would tell yourself now, if you were going back to, say, the 14-year-old Urs and giving him some advice now about life and leadership in a different way, what advice would you have given your younger self?
Be more courageous in charting your own course. That's what I was certainly for a lot of my adolescence and young adulthood trying to live up to. When I talked about my dad, while he was an amazing dad, he was also an uber father. He was so successful, and in many ways I tried to live up to his example and at times failed miserably. I got kicked out of pilot school and kicked out of school once because my grades weren't good enough. So I would tell myself, really be more courageous in charting your own course versus trying to live up to other people's expectations.
And then that will no doubt for anyone require courage and a little bit of bravery to step out one's comfort zone in that way. It's been fascinating to speak with you today, Urs, and I can see so many strong connections between your interest in ultra-endurance events and determination, focus, and all the qualities that are required for those types of activities that you also bring to how you communicate and express the work that you've written about in Radical Humility. So I very much enjoyed our conversation. It's energised me. If people do want to find out more about the book and about your work, how may they do that?
Yeah, just go to my website, urskoenig.com, or you find me on LinkedIn, which is where I'm most active. And then the listener in the US, Amazon is where you can find my book, but it's also on my website.
Well, it's been fantastic to speak to you today. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Sue. It was a lot of fun. Appreciate it.
Well, I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Urs Koenig. And if you're interested in leadership, then you may also like to listen to episode 37, where Samir Dua talked about mastering self-leadership through critical conversations. Remember, there's over 120 episodes in our back catalogue on subjects ranging from sports to the arts and social change. Just hop on over to accessedinspiration.org to discover them all. Next week, we have another guest-hosted episode where Manuela Gil will be talking to Maritza Lopez, a Colombian corporate leader who turned eco-entrepreneur. I hope you can join us then.